think we sometimes think about it as like beating someone over the side of the head until we win, but that's not really arguing. And I want to kind of impress upon you the importance of argumentation, which is trying to bring someone over to your side or your perspective. Hello. Well, the topic of today's class is argumentation, which is not the same as arguing. I think we all know what arguing is if we turn on cable news on any time of day, really. We can see two people screaming at each other, and that is what most people think when they think arguing. The thing about arguing is it doesn't really resolve a lot of things. If you put two people with different beliefs on a cable news show and have them scream at each other for 30 seconds, nobody changes their mind, and probably nobody watching will ever change their mind. Arguing, I think we sometimes think about it as like beating someone over the side of the head until we win, but that's not really arguing. And I want to kind of impress upon you the importance of argumentation, which is trying to bring someone over to your side or your perspective. I think there's three crucial things we need when we're talking about argumentation. You need to appeal to someone's brains, their logic, their mind. You need to appeal to someone's heart, their emotions. And finally, you need to convince people that you, the person trying to convince them to do something, is trustworthy and credible. My personal opinion is this last one, credibility, is the most important part of all three of those. You can have the best facts, you can have tear-jerking examples, but if you are not a trustworthy human being, you will probably not convince anyone. So about 4 years ago, I really learned this lesson. I was in the middle of huge personal upheaval. I had some really big choices in front of me, and I spent a lot of time trying to decide how I was going to make those choices. I spent a lot of time thinking about pros and cons. You know, if I do this, this will happen. If I do this, this will happen. What is the logical choice? I spent a lot of time interrogating my emotions. What do I believe about this? What did my church background teach me? What is my gut reaction to it? I also, enlisted the support of other people like pastors and counselors and friends. But I just kind of felt like I needed one more vote of confidence. So one day between classes, I texted my mom and I said, I think this is the decision I'm going to make, but I just want you to know, I want to know if you think I'm making a terrible choice. So she called me back. We talked for a few minutes. She asked me a lot of questions, which she's really good at doing. And she finally said, I think whatever you decide to do, because I know your moral character, I trust that you're making a good decision. Now, a little bit about my mom. She is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful woman with amazing moral judgment. She also gave birth to 5 children. She does not go around telling us we make wonderful decisions all the time. I would say in most of our childhood, she was very good at pointing out when we made really not good moral decisions. When we were young adults and older adults, she usually kept her mouth shut, but she does not give praise where praise is not due. So I'll just say that about her. So the fact that she trusted my decision, even if she wasn't sure if it was a great idea, told me a lot, and that taught me a lot in that moment. I felt, 1, really grateful that I had her support, and 2, really grateful that without really paying attention, I lived my life in a way that made me trustworthy. And that was a huge lesson for me going forward, that how you live your life in the little things can really influence your credibility in kind of big decisions. Now, you guys are freshmen in college, and you have some decisions and choices ahead of you this semester and this year. I hope none as big as I did. And some of those choices, you are going to have to bring other people on board with you. Deciding to get your roommate to get a room with you again next semester, deciding where you're going to go for spring break, deciding what to write your first research essay on, deciding what to choose at Baldwin, and maybe convincing someone to put extra cheese on your cheeseburger or something like that. You have all these decisions and choices and things you're trying to convince people of ahead of you, and you need to think about how you are going to use argumentation rather than just arguing with people to get where you want to go. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and for the sake of today's lecture, I've picked 2 decisions you're going to have to make. One, what you're going to write for your first essay, because you're all going to have an essay to write at some point this semester. Secondly, what to do for fall break. And I've decided that you guys really care about natural disasters. You care about helping people. So you've decided your first essay you're going to write, you're going to try to convince people to donate blood, because you think that's a really good thing for people to do. You've also decided you really want to go stay at your aunt's guest house in Michigan for fall break, but you don't want to go by yourself. You want your 2 roommates to come with you. So you need to convince your roommates to come along. In order to convince people, whether it's in your essay or whether it's for fall break, you're going to have to engage their logic, you're going to have to engage their emotion, and you're going to have to convince people that they can trust you. To help me out today, I would like to share with you some quotes from Martin Luther King Jr., one of America's most extraordinary rhetoricians. Coincidentally, this week is the anniversary of the March on Washington, where he gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. You guys all familiar with that? Read it in high school at some point? We're going to look at some examples from that today. So let's start by talking about logic, which is logos in the Greek. This is the scientist in you appealing to the scientist in other people. You're giving them facts, statistics, you're talking rationally, you're giving them very objective details, and you're doing this in a tone that shows a lot of objective, rational thought from you. So let's look at how Dr. King did this. Dr. King, when he gave a speech, he was always very aware of who his audience was. He took the time to research that and look into it. And he knew that many of the people who came to the March on Washington were there at some personal cost to themselves. So he writes, I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great risks and tribulation. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. So he's trying to motivate people to continue to march for justice, continue to push for their rights. But he's also saying, you know, I get where you're coming from. I have paid attention to this part. It's showing a lot of logic and restraint from him. He also, however, is always going to be pushing for what they have to do. And he writes, we cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and the Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. Very logical ideas. He's very aware of the situation in the country. In Mississippi, in the South, African Americans were prevented from voting by things like poll taxes and citizenship tests that were blatant attempts to keep them from being able to vote. In New York, they could vote, but they were still restricted by where they could buy property, if they could buy property, where they could work, where they could go to school. So there was a kind of a sense that maybe none of it mattered. Why should we do anything about that? He knows that idea and he confronts it head on and says, no, this is what we need to do in order to have justice. Really big ideas. Not quite the same as what you're going to do for fall break, but you can still use logic for this. And I think what we can learn from Dr. King is taking the time to logically analyze where our audience is at. Now, let's say for sake of example, you know that both of your roommates are really concerned with saving money. They do not want to spend a lot of money on fall break, or any money on fall break. You also know they are both nursing majors, and nursing majors have a lot of homework. They have some really important tests they have to pass, and they have a test the Monday after fall break. So they need to study over that weekend. So one thing you can use to convince them is, first of all, this is not going to be an expensive fall break trip. You offer to drive because you're a generous person, and you also tell them your aunt, who is also a generous person, is not going to charge any money for using her lake house. So it's not going to cost any extra money. You also tell them that because you're going to a quiet area and you don't have a really big agenda, you know, there's not like high school friends to go see or family to hang out with, you're going to have lots of time to do studying. And you think this is going to work for your appeals. Now, let's talk about how you use this in your essay, for your blood transfusion essay or your blood donation essay. You know that some people don't like needles and they get squeamish around blood. So what are some logical things you're going to use? Well, you do a little research and you find all the ways that blood donation can help people. Blood transfusions help small children with anemia. They help women who are in the middle of difficult deliveries. And they help people during natural disasters. You also find out that blood donation centers always need more blood because blood can only be stored for so long. So it's not like you can get it and save it for a couple years. They go through it very, very quickly. So this is another argument for people to always be regularly donating. So this is logic, and this is like the first part. This is the part where you really need to use the library. You need to do some like ground level work to establish your ideas and your facts. But that is not the only thing. People are emotional. We have hearts. We have feelings. And sometimes we don't feel like doing things. And sometimes we don't feel like doing things, but a good story can convince us otherwise. So this is where emotion, or in Greek, pathos, can help you out in an argument. This will be things like stories, vivid description, subjective opinions from the author, so your own input. This could be the tone you use. Is it angry, happy, sad, really convicting? All of those things are going to appeal to people's sense of emotion. And I think MLK was an absolute master at this. Now, we all know from the I Have a Dream speech, we know how it ends, where he's saying, I have a dream, and he's talking about white children and black children playing together, and like justice ringing out from every hilltop. But he does this the whole way through the essay. He is appealing to his audience's emotion the whole way through. And let's look at how he does that. He starts here by saying, 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree is a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. So from the start, he is calling attention to the fact that they are standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial, a president whom most Americans revere and love. He references the Emancipation Proclamation, which most Americans think was a very good thing and a very bad time in our country. So these are two emotional touchstones. He also points out how bad things had been for African Americans before that point. The withering injustice, seared in the flames. These are really dark, heavy images contrasted with a really positive image of Lincoln. So we've got that going on from the beginning. Throughout his speech, he uses this metaphor of African Americans have been given a check for justice, and when they go to cash it from America, America says, sorry, we don't have anything for you. And he says, you know, we cannot handle like being given a bad check. We are not going to put up with this. So about midway in his speech, he says, now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift up our nation from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. So even in the way he structures his sentences, he's kind of giving that cadence of maybe you know, a Baptist preacher who's continually amplifying the message. So he's doing that just with his sentences. And then he's saying, you know, we're going from a desolate valley to a sunlit path, two emotional extremes. We're going from quicksand to solid rock of brotherhood. He's painting two very clear pictures and kind of really inspiring his audience to go with him from the one, which is where they're at, which is miserable, to something much, much more beautiful, but maybe challenging to get there. So finally, at the end of his speech, he's saying, let freedom ring. And he's talking about let freedom ring from the mountains of New Hampshire to California, across the Midwest. So he's painting this beautiful picture of freedom ringing out all across America. But then he pauses, and there's a really interesting section where he talks about the South. He says, but not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. Now, you guys might be smarter than me, and you might have already known this, but I just learned a little bit about Stone Mountain this week. So after the horrible events in Charlottesville, I was reading a little bit more about Confederate monuments, and I was reading about Stone Mountain. Do you guys know about Stone Mountain? So it's in Georgia, and it's this mountain that's a rock face. In about 1915, thereabouts, they carved a relief of 3 Confederate generals into the face of the mountain. This mountain was also the place around 1915 where the Ku Klux Klan decided to kind of come back for a second round. They decided to reinvigorate themselves. So this location, and this happened in 1915, which was when the South was kind of resubjugating African Americans with Jim Crow laws. So the monument was very, very, very intentional, and MLK and African Americans at the time would have known Stone Mountain had that kind of significance. So this is a place that has huge symbolic resonance as a white supremacist model, and he's saying, let freedom ring there. Like, I believe freedom's gonna come there. I didn't find out much about Lookout Mountain in Tennessee, but Mississippi at the time was a terribly dangerous place to be an African American pushing for justice. And so he's saying even the molehills of Mississippi, we're gonna have freedom there too. So there's tremendous imagery there, and in a 21st century American, I can go, oh, that sounds really great. But knowing a little bit more about the place, I can say, wow, that's really moving that he had so much hope for a place that was so unjust in so many different ways. Again, really, really moving. Not quite on the same level as Fall Break, but you can still use emotion for Fall Break. Now, your 2 roommates, if they just wanted to not spend money and study, they could go home and do that. So how are you going to get them to go to Michigan with you? Well, you need to think about what Michigan is good at and what appeals to you about Michigan. So you think about how beautiful it is in the fall. It's going to be really pretty in October. You think about how beautiful your aunt's lake house is and what the shoreline of Lake Michigan looks like at that time of year. You might tell your roommates with a lot of description about the apple orchards you guys can go pick apples in and drink hot apple cider, and the coffee shop in town you can go to later to do some studying. You might also mention, because you know your roommates are compassionate people who love their families, that if they go home for fall break, they're probably going to want to spend all their time with their family and not study anyway. So we should just go to Michigan and have a nice quiet place, get our homework done, and go pick apples, the same. Academically, we have room for emotion too. I think sometimes we don't think about that. We think in academia, everything needs to be logical and very straightforward and fact-based. But the truth of the matter is you have room to use emotion here too. You just have to use it very, very wisely. So in your blood donation essay, how do you get someone who hates needles to emotionally get past that and go donate blood? Facts are probably not going to do it. They can say, well, who cares? Someone else can handle that. Statistics probably aren't going to do it. Stories probably will. I believe it was Stalin who said the death of 1 million people, or the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of 1 million people is a statistic. People care way more about one story than they do about a million statistics. So you do some research, because you can still use research to find emotional appeals, and you find out about a woman named Deb who, for whatever reason, had a very difficult pregnancy, and then she had a very difficult delivery of her baby girl, and she almost died, and a blood transfusion saved her life. You put that story in your essay. Now, you're very careful to cite it correctly. You make sure you don't plagiarize when you do it. You make sure the story comes from a reputable source, but you can still use that story to connect with your readers. You want to be careful with using emotion that you do not beat your readers over the head with it. Have you all seen that Humane Society commercial with the sad animals and Sarah McLachlan singing in the background? Yeah, I can't watch it. I love animals, and that just depresses me so much that I always turn it off. So you don't want to have that effect on your readers where you make them so miserable, or they think they're going to be so miserable that they just tune you out before they even listen to you. So with emotion, It's a matter of finding that fine line of how much is too much and how do I present it to them so that they listen and are moved, but not moved to just like misery. Because you do not want to manipulate people. People are very, very, very aware of when they are getting manipulated, and you need to watch out for that. But I think if you do that ethically, which ties into our last point, credibility, emotion can be a very powerful thing for you to use. So finally, credibility, the thing I think is most important in your argumentation. This comes from the Greek word for ethos. So a lot of times we tend to think of ethics. That does not have to do with the ethics of your topic. It has to do with the ethics of you, your credibility. So if I know that Emma is giving me a paper on this topic, do I trust that she did her homework and she really researched her topic and she is giving me the most honest version of this issue? Of course I do, because I know Emma. So credibility has a lot to do with you. Sometimes you aren't going to know how you are expressing your credibility. Sometimes you will, and you want to make sure you are doing the best job when you are consciously aware of that. Ways you express your credibility, things like the tone you use. So we were talking a little bit about tone in emails earlier today. How you express your tone in an essay is another way you show your credibility. Your examples and your sources. I don't know about you guys, but there are several people I'm friends with on Facebook that every time they post an article, I assume it's not true. That is because there's something about the tone that just sounds outraged. There's something about the word choice that's usually insulting to other people. And if I do a quick trip to Snopes, I usually find out it was debunked in like 2005. So if I see enough of those things from the same person, I'm just going to assume that they're probably not very trustworthy, and I'm not going to pay attention to what they do. Contrast to that to someone who I might disagree with, but I know that everything they post on social media or everything they write about or every time they tell me about a current event going on, I trust that they've done their background research and they know what they're talking about. People pay attention to that in you too. So you want to be aware of that as you live your life, how you are sharing information, how you are synthesizing information in an essay or in your conversations, and all of those kind of ways. So let's look at what MLK does. He says, in the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. One thing MLK was really good at is making sure the members of his nonviolent organization did a process of self-purification, that they really challenged their motives for why they were doing what they were doing. And before they went out on a peace march where there were going to be police dogs and water cannons, and maybe they were going to get beat, a really volatile situation where your impulse is probably to punch someone, that they're ready to handle that with a lot of peace. He also, later in the essay, and again, he's saying, we need to make sure we do this, but we also need to make sure we're pushing for justice. He says, no, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. If that phrase sounds familiar to you, it's because it's from the book of Amos. We know MLK as a wonderful activist, but he was also a completely well-trained theologian. He went to seminary. He knew his Bible very, very, very well. And he knew that this would be something that would inspire trustworthiness in the American people he was talking to. Okay, how can you use this for fall break and your essay? Well, a lot of this is going to be based on how you live your life with your roommate. So, for example, you give her lots of time, both your roommates lots of time to consider your proposal for where to go for fall break so they don't feel pressured. You offer to drive so they know you're not just using them for their cars or their gas money. You also show them you're good at planning by doing things like planning a day trip to Indianapolis and not getting the car towed, not going to a restaurant that's scary, not just driving to Indianapolis and then driving home again because you didn't know what to do. all things mistakes I made when I was in college. You don't do that though, because you're really good at planning, which inspires some trust in your roommates. For your essay, you expand your credibility by using really reputable sources. You cite your sources completely accurately. There is no hint of plagiarism when you quote or paraphrase from a source. You also proofread very carefully. I think we've all at some point driven by a sign, by a business that had a typo, and we thought, I'm never going to go there. Do the little things well, and it's going to help your arguments as you go forward. So since the election, I've had to remind myself how to use all of these aspects of argumentation and to use them really wisely. I've had to use them in my academic life. I've also had to use them in my personal life. And I believe that if everyone was a little bit more aware of these principles, we could probably make a lot more headway in a lot of the national debates we're having. It gives me a lot of hope that in 1963, when MLK was addressing people in the March on Washington and our nation was going through huge strife, these principles helped unite people. And my hope is that if we call on these principles now, we are going to be able to move forward and be able to make a much, much better nation, and you will have a much more solid and much happier college career. Thank you very much.